Hey everyone, welcome back to the Anchored in Learning podcast. It is your girl, Vanessa, and today we're going to talk about a favorite topic of mine and something I probably could do better, and that is the power of storytelling. And when I first, when Chatty and I first started going back and forth about my podcast topic for the day, I thought about, the power of storytelling in learning and development, right? Like in our actual programs and all of that fun stuff. But then I started thinking, as I do, and if you listen to the AI presentation, you know that I am the best at having a plan for podcast episodes and for YouTube videos, and then throwing that plan right out the window, or even presentations up until 20 minutes before. So if you ever wonder, hey, Vanessa, why is your presentation not uploaded? It's because I probably changed some slides 20 minutes before getting on stage. So I was sitting here thinking about it, prepping, and I was like, the power of storytelling doesn't actually just apply to learning. It applies to life. And how do we get that coveted seat at that table? And it applies to, really talking about, how do we make learning more aligned with the business? And we say, well, speak the language of the business, do this, do that, whatever. But I think it's actually all about storytelling first and foremost. I just got finished recording a podcast for the Kirkpatrick podcast. So if you are not subscribed to that, also subscribe to my other podcast where we talk all about learning and performance and the Kirkpatrick model and evaluation. And in that episode, we were talking with our guest who was talking about his presentation to go for our gold level, which is the highest level in the older version of the certification model that you could achieve. And so what Dr. Kirkpatrick and I were talking about with him was, the fact that he really embraced storytelling in order to help others, to display empathy, to really show people what's possible. And that is essentially, for me, what we're doing when we're trying to get that seat at the table. It's like we don't want to just go. I think we have this assumption. So this is wild, right? So we have this assumption that CFOs and CEOs and COOs, they want the data, they want the numbers. And yes, that is true, right? You need the data and the numbers and the facts and the figures. But what I think they actually mean by I want data, I want the data, is I want you to tell me the story first and foremost, and then support with the data behind it, and have that report. So I want to follow up more and really dive into the data. That is where, I can do that. But at the end of the day, I want you to give me the synopsis and that story of why is this important? What is it crucial? What's the pain point? What problem is this solving? And how is this going to transform, my life or my, our organization, impact our employees? Numbers aren't going to tell you that. Stories will. And the thing about stories is, the name of the game and selling and persuasion and all of those things is changing hearts to change minds. People remember not what you say, but how you made them feel in a really well-crafted story that really encapsulates and engulfs you into the story where you just have to know more. I have to know how this ends. That is how you get amazing. That's how you create change. And that's how you really leave a lasting impact. So this morning, actually, I was on LinkedIn, and Donald Taylor, if you don't know him, you should follow him on LinkedIn. He does the L&D Global Sentiment Survey every year. It should still be out at the time of this launch, or it's out right now during recording. But anyway, he asked a question for a colleague, like, how do you create engagement for these trainings and these programs that are mandatory, that people walk in and like roll their eyes like, all right, here we go. The year, the next sexual harassment training for the year, like we got to retake it, or cybersecurity. And what, as I was scrolling through, I think there were like up to like 50 comments last I looked. Like as I'm scrolling through them, and the advice that I put in there was, it's about the story. If we eradicated cybersecurity risks, there probably would not be cybersecurity training. The reason there is cybersecurity training every single year is because probably you are dealing with risks. You just don't know about it, right? They're not going to announce it over the loudspeaker like, excuse me, Sally over in accounting. Yeah, she opened up an attachment that was a virus and almost brought it down our entire firewall. Like that's not going to happen. You only know about it if you happen to know Sally and she tells you like, oh, I kind of effed up. And so when we look at, and so what happens is, right, like we have all of these things that are happening in our world. We have all of these projects, all of these tasks, and I'm not going to update the cybersecurity training unless there's a policy change, because that is done. Take it off the shelf, or, resend it out to everybody, reassign it, and let's go. I need to move on. I can't worry about updating it. Now imagine if we took just a little bit of time, not a ton, right, to tell a story about why it's important and what are some close calls or some disasters that we had that show, hey, we actually still need this training because things are happening. Things aren't changing, or aren't changing, I should say. Even if you don't change the training per se, which I recommend using a storytelling format, and not doing this, wait until this next button enables so you can click next for, hours. But anyway, if you're not going to do that, bare minimum, and you want someone to engage and understand why this is important to them, tell them a story as to why it's important and why it's still relevant to this day. The example that I gave in that LinkedIn post was, my husband, probably a sexual harassment training where he works now, but his last company had mandatory sexual harassment training every single year. And he was telling me about it. And he was telling me like this example that they literally laughed at. They're like, this is so unrealistic. Like, no one talks like that. No one says these things. That's why storytelling doesn't work in L&D, because we're crafting stories that aren't realistic. Because we're not actually talking to the people to tell those stories. And maybe the only people that we're talking to are like our friends and this and that. So like, how are, there's no, it's not a real scenario. It's not a real story. Or we try to make it so easy that people can guess it just to like check the box. Oh, we did storytelling. Did you though? Did you do scenario-based training, or did you give them the right answer and then two really unrealistic wrong answers? So it's very clear what the answer and the outcome should be. Now, going back to my husband's example, right? Like, I'm like, okay, great. So like, that's unrealistic, but like, he worked for a big university. Like, I bet you sexual harassment still happens, This doesn't just go away. And I was like thinking about it. And I was like, it's because our examples are so unrealistic, because we don't talk to the people how it still happens. Like, we have this assumption of how, like, we're going to go down the rabbit hole of sexual harassment, right? What sexual harassment looks like, the most overt versions of sexual harassment. But sexual harassment that happens today isn't so overt. It's more covert. Or there's microaggressions that happen, like all of these things that are like, again, like assumptions and bias. And I like that should have been the name of this podcast, because I feel like that's like all I talk about. But if we started putting more of those sorts of examples into our programs, then maybe we could get to a point one day when maybe people aren't, sexually harassing others. Probably not, but you know what I'm saying here. it starts to feel more relevant. They start to engage more because you're going to stop and think like, oh, I witnessed that. I didn't even think of it that way. I wouldn't have perceived it that way because I have my own perception or whatever it is. I didn't realize that, could be considered sexual harassment to someone. That is why storytelling can be so important. But in order to get those stories, you have to really do the work to uncover them. And I think inherently, we just don't have enough time. And we operate so much asking for permission that we know we're probably never going to get. So it's easier to blame someone else and say, I couldn't do a needs analysis. Okay, maybe you can't do a full needs analysis, start gathering those stories and things like that. But you can start to identify who your learner is, who's the target audience during the intake process when you get the training request, and go out and just talk to those people. Maybe you can't send a formal survey to them, but they'll probably talk to you for a few minutes, But if you don't gather the actual stories, it's really hard to create any change and to really create engagement and learning. Going back to how this is a bigger conversation than just, learning and development strategy to create more engaging training. This is where qualitative data is so rich. And I think we shy away from qualitative data because it's not as easy to analyze, right? So if I create a survey, I can, the Survey Monkey or Qualtrics or whatever my platform is of choice, Google Forms is going to create a nice little graph for me. And that's really cut and dry what the, what the numbers look like. And I can just export that. And there you go. Here's the numbers. That just tells you numbers. It doesn't tell you the stories. The qualitative data is where you're going to get those stories. And that's what's going to change strategy. That's what's going to shift the organization. That's when where you're going to say hey, look, the data is showing us that the training alone wasn't sufficient. But people really found the job aid that we provided much more effective. I have this sales rep here that said, I can't remember anything that I learned in training, but pulling out that job aid on my phone really helped me to navigate the system super quickly so I could get back to doing what I was doing and was more efficient with my day. I don't know. So we say hey, I want to do things differently. I want to do less training that we know doesn't work and provide more performance supports. You got to ask the questions, and you got to ask not just the quantitative questions, but the qualitative questions to gather out that story, to then put that story in front of them. They want to hear from their people. CEOs don't have time to talk to every single person. And also, to be honest, are we ever really that truthful when we talk to a CEO? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. Depends on your relationship and how ballsy you are. I could say there are some CEOs that I had a great relationship with and could be totally honest with. And some that I didn't have that relationship, so I didn't feel safe to have the true conversation about how I felt. And even some CEOs, I will tell you this, depending on the context of what I was talking about, some things I had no problem telling them. And then other things I was like, yeah, I'm just going to hide that one, or not really give the full story. For us as learning folks, or just people in general, I think we look at storytelling as having to craft the next, great American novel. This is where I implore you to pick up Donald Miller's StoryBrand guide. It's a marketing book. Your girl loves marketing. But pick up that book, because in that book is going to give you a very simple formula for storytelling. You just need a hero and a guide. So if you want to craft your own story, that's a great place to start. Another book, Rand Screen's Story Design. That's from the learning perspective. There's all these ways to tell a story. That's super simple. I think too, like when I talk about TikTok style training, people say, well, how do you convince someone to do TikTok style training? And I'm like, I tell them the story of what I learned. I tell them the story of what they learned from TikTok. I tell them the story of what another person learned and how quickly and how they were able to implement it. I didn't tell them the facts and the figures of memory and cognition. And I talked to them like a human being. Like I was talking to a friend and I told them the story. And stories help to show that you're empathetic, show not only your empathy for the learner, but empathy for the person that's receiving the information as well. You want them to know this. You want them to have the true insight of what is actually happening because you want them to make better decisions. And stories are data. We have to stop looking at data as just facts, figures, and numbers. Stories contain data too. Where we fall into the trap is by not listening broadly, and really talking to the same people or making assumptions and crafting the story, not even talking to people. We just make assumptions on the story and we say, oh, well, this is what I see in my perception of how things are. So it's time that we start to really look at what are our skills in storytelling and do we have them? I mean, it's why like true crime podcasts are so popular. Besides, I think people really like mysteries and murder, which is a problem in and of itself, but here we are. But it's a story. You get engrossed in it, but you learn something and you walk away. You remember that true crime episode, right? And the best true crime podcasts are the ones that tell it in a story fashion, where you have the inflection, you have, the person that's telling the story is more animated. They're jumping in, they're pulling back out. So think about how you can not just craft a story, but tell it. Tell the stories so that people want to listen to you. They want to engage with you. For the most part, like this is going to sound cocky, but here it is. I'm actually going to say it publicly. When I talk, people listen. Why? Because I engage. I use language that is language that they use. In presentations, I walk around the room. I will look you dead in the eye to make sure you're engaged and you're pulled into the story and what I'm saying. I inflect my voice. I bring it down. I pause. All of those pieces are ways to craft a really great story that someone remembers. So next time you're thinking about, well, how am I going to persuade my boss to do this? Or how am I going to persuade the C-suite to do that? Or how am I going to engage my learners in a mandatory training that we know they're going to hate? Think about how you're going to craft the story. How can I tell the story? What is the story? What's a realistic story I could tell them that's really going to hit them? And then how can I tell it in a way that's going to draw them in? Where there's suspense, there's a climax, like all of those things. How can I do that? That is like that presentation of it all is almost half the battle. I could tell you a story and you could be really bored by it. It's a good story, but if I didn't really like build up the suspense and, zhuzh it up for you, act it up a little bit, you're not going to remember it. So when your CEOs and your CFOs and all your people are looking for new things, the storytelling, that is what they're looking for. So I'd love to hear your tips of how you're using storytelling either in your work, to gain buy-in, all of those things. Friends, thank you so much for listening to this episode, and I'll catch y'all on the next one. Bye.